Welcome to the TFD Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Sullivan, and this is a show where we break down popular science into easily digestible and actionable information to give you the blueprint to be a high performer in your life. Today, I'll be talking to Istok Stanojevic. Istok has a background in psychology and social work practice with over 20 years of experience working in the fields of acquired brain injury, youth justice, and child protection. He teaches forensic narrative interviewing and child protection at the Queensland Police Academy and is a sessional academic who lectures and teaches at QUT since 2015 and more recently at Southern Cross University. He is also one of the instructors at Shindo New Breed, one of the very first MMA gyms in Australia, where he has coached and mentored fighters and athletes since 1999. Today we are discussing a few very important topics, including masculinity, more specifically toxic masculinity and healthy masculinity, how combat sports can be used as a powerful tool to direct young males' innate tendencies, the power of combat sports for mental health, how to mentally separate the person you are in training from your everyday self, and the importance of recognizing the full spectrum of your emotions. I'll leave the rest of the talking to the episode because this is an absolute banger. Let's get to it. All right, we are back for another episode of the TFD Performance Podcast. This episode, I'm very, very excited to bring you guys. Today on the show, we have Istok Stanojevic. Did I get it right, Istok?
Nailed it.
Nailed it. I've practiced that about 3 times before we went live on that. But Istok, thanks so much for taking the time for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Istok, can you tell us a little bit about, I'd give the listeners a rundown, but I'm absolutely not going to do you the credit that you deserve. Can you give us a little bit of a rundown about what you do in your day-to-day life, what you do for work, and then also where you spend a lot of your time outside of work?
Sure. Thanks. So I work for Queensland Government, Department of Children, Youth Justice, Multicultural Affairs. And my primary job is working in the child protection space. So I do a lot of like practice development stuff and like child death reviews and so on. Outside of that, my background's in psychology and social work, and I've spent last 20 years working in acquired brain injury initially, and then on to sort of youth justice. And I've been in the child protection space for, the last 10 years or so. I also do a bit of sessional academic work through QUT and more recently Southern Cross University in the sort of postgraduate programs around social work and psychology. But aside from the sort of professional realm, I'm also part of the coaching crew at the Shindo New Breed MMA, and that's on the Gold Coast. And we've been around since the late 90s. I think one of the oldest MMA gyms in Australia. That's kind of the elevator pitch version. I always feel awkward talking about myself, so that's a real quick snapshot.
Yeah, it is hard. Hey, giving everyone the 30-second pitch on your entire life is difficult, but it's interesting, right? And that's why I want to talk to you, Istok, because you've got this background. And I think obviously everyone who listens to the show knows that I work predominantly with combat sport athletes. Istok is a combat sport athlete, so he's immersed in it. But with your background, it's so interesting how the world's kind of intertwined, right?
Yeah, very well said. And I think that the whole combat sports realm is one that there's a lot more depth to it than people think. And there's a lot more interconnections between various parts of life outside of combat sports. So for me, like a big area of interest, both in terms of my work as a coach and sort of in terms of my own personal growth and development, is around the idea of like, what does fighting mean to us, and particularly for like young men coming up who come into the sport with probably less than accurate mental image of what it takes to be successful and what the journey to becoming an effective combat athlete looks like, and just sort of addressing some of the sort of men's mental health issues and like the concepts like toxic masculinity, which I know is a really triggering, for lack of a better word, phrase for a lot of men. I've got a real interest in that space, and it's probably one of the things that's kept me interested and engaged, because there's always new up and coming young guys, and they're always coming up with very similar, but in a lot of other ways, variable problems to talk through. So yeah, it's something I'm really passionate about.
There's so many things I want to get into with you, and that is one topic I most definitely want to go into is the toxic masculinity. Before we go into that, we're not going to do quite a 30-second elevator pitch, but I do want to get a little bit more of in depth of what took you down this career path? What was it that made you go, okay, you know what, I want to get into psychology and social work, and then go into acquired brain injury, work with youth justice, child protection? It's a crazy field, right? Like, what's the story behind getting into it?
Honestly, when I was getting towards the end of my time in high school, I in year 12, I actually lost two friends, one to suicide, and another to an acquired brain injury. Um, and that made me change my preferences. Like I took an interest in, well, mental health and suicide, particularly initially, and then also brain injury. And I started volunteering at a brain injury unit while I was studying. And when I graduated, they offered me a job, and I worked there for, oh geez, yeah, 10 years. And then towards the end of that, I stayed at that location in the acquired brain injury unit. I got a little bit comfortable, a little bit complacent work-wise, but it was affording me the opportunity to train and compete and do all those fun things. Um, and then, yeah, around 2008, 2009, I kind of came to the end of having any formal aspirations for future competition. And I determined that in terms of the martial arts side of things, I would take a more active role in sort of coaching and mentoring. And at the same time, thought I would challenge myself by changing career paths into something a bit more justice oriented. Didn't want to be a cop. So I became a child protection and youth justice advocate. So that's taken me all around the state, and into youth detention centers and various kind of sketchy locations as well. Number of bikie dens and stuff like that. And what I found really interesting about that whole journey is that the sector I work in is female dominated. Like the majority of the frontline workers are women. And out of the vast majority of people that I've worked with, probably very few have trained or had the degree of experience with martial arts that I have. But I found consistently in a lot of these sort of dangerous environments that I had a lower, much lower than average rate of anything approaching a dangerous incident coming about. Um, and that sort of deepened my interest into sort of the influence that we individually and our sort of behaviors and actions have on our environment. And a bit of a sort of like long rambling answer, but surprisingly, I found the two worlds really synergized well. My training helped me in my work, and my work helped me better understand my training.
For sure. And you said this earlier about there is this idea and preconceived notions. Anyone in the general public will appreciate this is when you think fighting, like straight away, your mind just goes to aggressive young men, violent young men that get in it. What's your experience? Do you see any similarities between like the work that you're doing, say, in youth work and in that in the young gyms, or is it completely different? Or why do you think there even is that preconception out in the public?
It's a very good question. I think a lot of people. Okay, how long have we got? This is a long one.
Let's go. Let's go into it. I want to go deep.
I got a lot of thoughts on this. For one, I think that people are really kind of nervous and hesitant to acknowledge the inherent capacity for violence that we all have. And I think that there's a reason why a lot of traditional martial arts that may not be so effective are still so popular. And I think part of that is that illusion of capability that it gives people. I mean, it's much easier and more gratifying to go through some motions, pull a few poses, not get hurt, not get any sort of pain or fatigue, and to go about your life thinking that you have the ability to defend yourself if something comes up. And we know that anyone who hasn't trained in an alive way, so people who haven't trained in full contact contexts against fully resisting opponents with pressure tested techniques, the second that something real happens, they immediately start resembling an untrained fighter, or a novice. And I think this is sort of related to the idea about we have this perception of like the innate sort of violence and what draws people to it. A lot of people, I think, are initially drawn to martial arts and self-defense because ultimately they have a degree of fear or worry about their ability to defend themselves, either now or into the future. And there's a very small subset of people, I think, who have I don't know, the wherewithal, for lack of a better word, to stick with something as challenging and difficult as training in a combat sport long enough to get good. There's like in the jiu-jitsu sense, there's that whole blue belt kind of cliff that most people fall off. Um, and I think that in my experience, I've seen a lot of angry, displaced, and disconnected young men come to our gym, particularly with an intention of finding not only a way to have an outlet for the sort of anger and sort of other issues they've got and an escape from whatever difficulties they're having outside of the gym, but also I think that that very quickly changes. And I think it very quickly becomes an understanding that there's something hugely beneficial about putting yourself in stressful situations and working to overcome adversity. Um, and I'm certainly not the most politically correct person, but like I know that a lot of people have this aversion to the idea of like a participation medal generation that we're in. And it's true. I think a lot of people have no idea about the level of sacrifice or dedication that these fighters have, and the degree of science that goes into it. And again, I know it's a bit of a rambling answer, but one of the things that I've really observed in particularly in young men in combat sports is that when growing up, we don't get the same sort of palette of emotions to paint with that say women get in their upbringing. And so for a lot of young men, they're immediately sort of put into this box about, well, the only negative emotion you're really allowed to show is anger. And, all of the greatest insults that we level at young men are feminizing insults, like that. So the implicit sort of underlying thing to that is that we're projecting onto young men this idea that, you feel no emotion. Your only negative emotion you can express is anger. And over time, that brings up a generation of men who are emotionally stunted. And who have like this inability to really contend with themselves and each other, which is why we have such a significant problem with suicide, domestic and family violence, any host of negative social outcomes. And for me, I think the irony is that a violent, quote unquote, thuggish pursuit such as combat sports and diligent training in them and competition in them, I think is actually one of the keys to a healthier and more well-adjusted society. Um, a hot take, but I genuinely believe that.
I absolutely agree. I think the world would be such a better place if everyone was forced to do something like jujitsu or, MMA or something like that in high school. If you put
100%.
young gentlemen that were growing up and you put them in that environment where they had to learn that, you can't just spaz out and have these little anger fits, because there are consequences to that. You have to learn how to control that stress, and you have to come up with coping mechanisms, because that's what it is, right? Like everyone
Absolutely.
remembers their first, not even, everyone says 6 months at jiu-jitsu, but realistically it's like your first 2 years, isn't it? Like you just get pounded for 2 years before you really dish out anything and you're in a position where you do it. And it is, like you said, you're just constantly in that stressful position, and what goes through your mind is crazy. I remember when I started jiu-jitsu, that was one of the craziest things that's happened to me, is that I realized very quickly that trying to tap into that anger like that was uncontrolled does not get you very far at all. And it's so detrimental, right?
100%. Perfectly said. And like, I think all combat, whether it's striking, grappling, or a combination of the two, it's a sequence of decision making. Like that's what it is. It's like making decisions under pressure. And the better you train and the more methodical you are in your process, the better your natural decision making gets in those stressful situations. You learn how to regulate your breathing, you learn how to pace yourself, you learn how to take initiative. And like ultimately, I think avoiding the idea of combat in at all is futile, because if you look at any other sport, when things aren't going someone's way or they get frustrated, things fall over, eventually it eventuates into fighting. Like that's the lowest common denominator in it all. And like I can't recall exactly, but I think it was Aristocles who said that the very first athlete may have been a runner, but he was probably running from a wrestler.
No, that's awesome. That's perfect. So, Istok, I want to come back to this idea that we're talking about, the ideas of masculinity, because we're talking about, when the general public thinks about, say, fighting or whatever, you do think of, okay, aggressive young men. But if you go into an MMA gym, jiu-jitsu gym, kickboxing gym, whatever it is, it's not like you just have young, angry men, is it? You've got guys, girls, people from all walks of life. For you've got people from surgeons. We've got a top heart surgeon in our gym, and then we've got, guys that work in the mines and the most blokiest blokes you'll ever meet. Like it's everywhere on the scale. What is it, do you think, that's attracting these guys to come to that environment, to be able to express themselves in that environment? And why is it so appealing? And once they get in there, it's so addictive to them.
I think honestly, there's a lot of potential answers to that. And I think every fighter will have a slightly different version of their response to that. But I genuinely think, maybe I'm a bit naive here, but I think there's a deep-seated desire for authenticity and integrity in people. And I can't think of anything that's a more honest, like social exchange than fighting with somebody. Um, like most people would agree that you can learn more about someone's character and their nature in 5 minutes of conflict with them than you could in 5 months of conversation. Even things like how they respond to adversity, how they react to discomfort, how they react to opportunity, whether they're malicious in their sort of underlying instincts or not. Like there's so much about who you are as a person that you can't really fake effectively in fighting because you don't have that luxury. Everything's so stripped back and it's so real. And I think for a lot of people who aren't necessarily sure about who they really are, or don't necessarily have a lot of trust in their circle or in the people around them, or just have like a lot of stress in their life, I think there's something that if you haven't done it, you couldn't really comprehend just how sort of liberating or freeing it is to have those, 1 hour or 50 minutes or 40, whatever it might be, that you're away from all the problems of the world and you're forced to be completely mindful. Because if you don't, you're going to get jacked. Like you have to be attending to the task at hand. You can't be elsewhere.
Yeah, I love that saying. What is it? It's no matter, once you hit the mats, no matter how much money you have in your pocket, the car that you drive, the house you live in, none of that matters. Once you get on the mats, it's all an even playing field. And like you said, everyone's a blank canvas once you get there. But it's like, I want to ask you, because obviously you do see some similarities about when you're working with these youth in your youth work, and then you've coached for many, many, many years with young athletes, young males coming up. There's obviously an approach that you need to take when you're with youth workers. Like I highly doubt you can just double leg one of these guys if they're giving you the shits and then just start ground and pounding them, which you could probably get away with in the gym if someone's giving you the shits. But what is it that you do with those guys that's similar to that? Because I'm assuming that at the core, you're probably using the same principles in both situations, but how are you applying them differently in both of them?
That is an excellent question. I think there's a lot of layers to it, but I think the first is genuinely and sincerely treating people with respect. And for that respect to not be tied to outcomes, but rather to attitude. That's huge for me. And so when you get a lot of younger guys coming up in the gym, for example, obviously they have less experience or capability than you might have yourself, at least for the beginning stages. And during those early stages, I mean, they quickly will develop a degree of respect for you on the basis of what you can do that they can't potentially do. And I think it would be really appealing to the ego to sort of bask in that and to feed that from people. But it's actually a really critical and valuable opportunity to have a conversation with them about, well, it's great that you're treating me with respect, or that you're, showing sort of positive regard for myself or other people in the gym or outside of the gym. But like the real question is why? Like, why is it that you are treating me, or why is it you hold me in high regard, for example? And if it's purely because of my capacity to behave in a violent way, that's the wrong reason. I would much rather be respected than feared. And I would much rather, be able to say genuinely that someone who has regard or respect for me does so because of my values or my ethics. And so with the guys in the gym over time, obviously it's important that they do get good at the violence. Like they have to, it's a performance-based sport. But at the same time, I think if their intentions aren't really well thought out, And if they're just fixating purely on this hierarchical perspective of the person who fights best is the best person, and I respect them the most purely for that, they will come to a point where they become very brittle. Like where we've all had that moment where, you know, you've been sparring or fighting or doing something competitive, and you've realized that the opponent you're with might have you outmatched in virtually every way. And I know for me, Big Jim York, an old friend of mine, very big guy, very, you know, well-known MMA fighter from the early 2000s. I remember working with him, and he's like what 130 kilos or something, and just athletically gifted, you know, like, and just thinking, I can't do anything to this dude. And if I got up and tried to run away, he would be able to run me down too. I'm not even as fast as him. Um, and that was a really crystallizing moment for me. And this was years and years ago, but I came to that realization of like, well, I mean, athletic ability is valuable and it's important, and the ability to fight is important. But like, you have only so many years, you know, that you can compete at a top level. And what remains of you, and what have you built of yourself in terms of your own character and who you are as a person by the time, you know, you reach the end of your competitive career. So bringing that full circle to when I'm working with young people outside of the gym, in like a child protection setting, it all begins with relationship for me, I think. Being genuinely respectful and taking the time to get to know somebody, and really, you know, say what you mean what you say, follow through, be consistent. And like, and in the end, when I'm working with families, most of my clients are involuntary. Like, they don't have the option to choose to work with me. And that results in like a power imbalance where I have power and authority over them should I choose to use it. And I never would, like, unless it was absolutely necessary. And I treat the fact that I'm with someone in one of the most difficult times of their life, and that I'm having an insight into their life that most people don't get, that's a privilege. And I should be thankful and grateful for that, just as I am for the opportunity to work with every young fighter that I have. And for me, I can't speak for everybody, but for me, I think that genuinely believing that and being thankful and respectful is, it's everything. Belonging is everything. And so that's the foundation. I think that's the thing that's the same for me, whether I'm working with an athlete or just a young person in general. I think it starts with like respect for yourself and respect for them. Like, that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. And we were talking a little bit off air there, Stock, about how when you kind of get up and you say, if you want to take this competitive and you go, yeah, I want to be serious about this, and you want to go to a competitive level, say you're under the bright lights, you might be, you know, in a jiu-jitsu tournament with a stadium full of people, with everyone's looking at your mats or whatever. We were talking about how some athletes kind of find calm in that chaos, and they find that place where there's all this, everything's going on in it, that's their happy place. Can you talk to us about why is that? Why is it some people find that?
Yeah, absolutely. So generally speaking, for most people, who've had a difficult or traumatic or dangerous upbringing, you will develop a number of sort of psychological patterns that have allowed you to sort of survive and thrive in that environment. And one of those sort of typical patterns for young men, particularly, I think, is that you can become hyper vigilant, like where you're always kind of on, you're always alert, and that on some level, like, you're always sort of up here in terms of your activation level, even if you're outwardly appearing calm. You know, and there can be elements of anxiety like around that. And so for a lot of men that I've encountered who've had like a number of adverse childhood experiences, whether they were in a violent home growing up or they saw a lot of violence in their community or whatever the case might be, that for them, when everything is quiet and there's nothing happening, it doesn't feel peaceful. It can be anxiety inducing, and your subconscious mind can really start playing tricks on you in terms of like something bad is going to happen. Or, and so when you're in a situation, and I've certainly found this myself, where the shit hits the fan and everything's all of a sudden chaotic and there are real and present threats to contend with, there's something almost that's almost a relief in that, because you don't have to spend any mental image in worrying about what could be. You're having to attend to and contend with like a manifested real threat or obstacle. And there's something about that that for a lot of men, where they will say they feel most at peace or like they're managing their world when there is a clear and present threat. Like, yeah, in short, that's basically it.
So my next question is, where do you draw the line of where this becomes negative in not only your sport, but in your life? Where, for example, say if someone does enjoy the chaos, you could appreciate that if you're a boxer and you're getting punched the shit out of and you got your hands up in the corner, being able to slow that time down and make smart decisions under that pressure. Yes, that could be positive. But say in general life, is that as acceptable if you're just sitting around and watching TV and you're almost seeking that type of environment? Where is the line? Where do you draw the line where that type of chaos seeking behavior becomes negative?
Excellent question. And I think there's a lot of different thoughts on that for people. But in my experience, I think having an outlet if in the first instance is valuable. And they call it things like catharsis, like where back in like the 80s and 90s, people would be like primal screaming or like, hitting a tree with a bat or whatever it might be to get that negative energy out. Well, the research has kind of indicated that that only provides really short-term sort of relief and actually trains you to activate more easily. So that's problematic. Whereas, and I think a big difference is if you're someone who does combat sports, it forces you sort of, there's like almost evolutionary pressure where just to survive, you have to continuously learn how to regulate yourself and you're both getting that outlet, but you're also processing your emotion kind of in real time. Um, and I think where that impulse, and it's certainly not an impulse that all men have, but there's enough of us that do feel a bit prone to sensation seeking or engage in like urgency addiction or end up getting into thrill seeking pursuits. And there's probably a good spot to talk about it. I think it's actually where it becomes problematic is when it becomes part of a cluster of situational event and behaviors that increase the risk of suicide. Um, and what I mean by that is if you look at something like the interpersonal theory of suicide, there are three elements that need to be present in order for someone to end their own life. The first is like the desire to end one's life, and the second half of it is the ability to do so. And the desire to end your own life, this has two components. One is thwarted belonging, so not feeling a sense of connection to a community or to a group or like that you identify with. And the other is perceived burdensomeness, which is where you start feeling like people would be better off if you're not around. Where both those two things are present, like a lack of belonging and perceiving yourself as a burden, that equates to you having the will to end your life or the potential desire. The capability to end your life, like we have this strong animal instinct that prevents us from self-harming and suicide. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but if you've ever been up on top of like a high cliff or face or something, or a high building where you almost feel like you're being pulled off the edge. So the way that works is that's your brain like making you feel like you're being pulled off the edge so that you withdraw somewhat. It's that protective instinct. And how this ties into suicide, risk-taking behaviors, getting into lots of fights, putting yourself in dangerous situations, skydiving, cliffs, like all this sort of stuff. The more you engage in these sort of behaviors, the more it helps you sort of offset that innate self-preservation instinct. So when all those factors are present, if someone's doing a lot of highly risky behaviors, they're building up their adrenaline tolerance and all of that. They're also feeling like they're a burden on themselves or the people around them, and they don't belong to something, they don't have connection. Those are the factors that enable and lead to people taking their lives by suicide. Which is where, for me, things like combat sports are, depending on the environment that you're in, or the culture of the gym that you're in and the people that you're associating with, can be life-saving and massively beneficial, both in terms of building connections to something and to someone, having a group of people that you connect with and that you rely on and that you have deep relationships with. Like, there's your fighting mates and your non-fighting mates, and it's a different bond that you have. And then on top of that, finding safe and healthy outlets for those thrill-seeking impulses as well. Whereas if you're in an environment where there's no structure or culture, and the people around you don't care about you, and you're being pushed into doing dangerous and risky things, and you're being given role models around what it means to be a man that involve being just like an aggressive, angry sort of person, like all of these factors massively increase the risk of negative mental health outcomes for young men. So yeah, I think I could talk for days on that topic, but I think that whole thrill seeking, or that whole urgency sort of feeling that some men get, it's dangerous if it's not channeled into something productive. So I think a lot of mental work needs to be done as well for people. It's like they need to be able to get in tune with what their emotions are, understanding why they react in the ways they react to other men and to women and to people in their community. And for me, the ultimate goal for anyone that I work with in like a fighting context is for them to be able to take whatever they've learnt about themselves and about the world through fighting and turn that into things that will help them continue that journey of growth and development and self-actualization post their competitive career. Because combat sports are a meat grinder, like the very few people have what it takes to be elite and to make a meaningful living out of it. And it's a really strenuous pursuit. Like there are a few things in this world I think that would be harder than to go, both feet in to a career as a competitive combat athlete.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to get onto that, but something I do want to touch before we move on to the next subject, Istok, is, and I could be wrong in this, but, and correct me if I am, what I'm hearing is that a lot of males, we have this innate sense to almost seek out these, or not dangerous activities, but these thrill or more violent activities. And then say the guys that do get involved in combat sports are probably the guys that may be more prone to doing that. Is it then a case, do you need to actively then find the balance? And I know we are talking about earlier that, there is a lot of toxic masculinity just in society, right? With just the slurs we use with other guys when we're growing up. Do you find that it's beneficial then to, if you're this type of person, and everyone that is in combat sports like that is probably this type of person, do you have to actively then work on balancing it the other side? Is it a yin and yang thing where, okay, you know what, I need to work on bringing myself down and being able to like sit down and slow down and think about these things and get in touch with my emotions, and what if I'm feeling this way, I need to be okay with express. Is it a yin and yang thing, or is it completely okay to go full this way?
I'm never a believer in going full anything. To be honest, I think I think you said it really well. I think that it's critical. And I'm not one to use sort of like cheesy analogies too much, but when you look at like a samurai sword when they forge it, I mean, there's two types of steel that they use, one that's soft and one that's hard. And the idea is that the softer steel, or the lower carbon steel, can be made more sharp, like it can be sharpened more effectively, but it's a weaker metal. And so you need that combination of like strength and rigidity, as well as like flexibility and adaptability, in order to be a completely well-rounded sort of human. And I think the same is very much true of like emotional development. I mean, if all you know is how to lean into the yang, like that strength and that sort of bulldozing energy, that will eventually like get to a level where you either come across someone who is more able to exist in that space than you are, or when you've run out of options in that realm and you're left with a less than suitable toolkit for how to process things. And I think it's critical. I mean, you can't, like, not to wax philosophical, but like you can't really know anything without considering it in relation to something else. I know that sounds like a bit of a woo-woo thing to say, but you can't really understand what like strength is if you don't have a sense of what flexibility or adaptability is on a human level, in my view. And so yeah, I think it's crucial, and particularly because it's hard, right? Like if you're always doing the easy thing and reverting to like the most convenient and easy toolkit that you have. The whole thing about if the only tool you have is a hammer, all your problems look like a nail. It's inherently self-limiting and unsatisfying, I think.
So what are some practical tools then? Because it is like in anyone, not just in combat sports, if you hang out with guys, if you have mates that are dudes, you know this because dudes, whether it is an innate thing, whether it's a cultural, societal thing, we do suck at talking about our feelings. We do suck at tapping into that other side of it. It's very easy, not easy, but people probably have a preference to kick into the aggressive gear rather than maybe pull off to the other side and hit reverse and talk about those other things. What are some practical things if guys are listening to this? You know what? Like, man, I'm not good at managing my emotions. I'm good at going to the gym and steam, like bulldozing my emotions away with a under, with my gloves on or kicking things. What are some practical things they can do to get more over that side?
Excellent question. I think one of the biggest things that I've observed is that if you don't have like a really good sense of like your emotions, that the best place to start is like somatically, so like with what's happening in your body, and getting people to sort of down regulate. So an example of that is in the lead up to a fight. A lot of men go through a lot of emotions, and it's a hard thing for men to talk about. I think is like, well, what if I lose, or like, what about all the people who are coming to watch, or like, oh, is my prep good enough? Have I done my weight cut well? Did I like, whatever? How many tickets have I been able to sell? Like all of this stuff that comes up for people. Um, and 9 times out of 10, when I ask a young fighter like how they're feeling, they will say that they feel excited or they feel a bit anxious or whatever. But beyond that, they don't really have like the language to describe what they're feeling. They're not even sure what they're feeling, in a lot of cases. And so what's really valuable is to sit down with people, I think, and to sort of start by saying, well, what do you feel in your body? Like what, how does that, when you say that you're feeling excited, how does that feel? Like, what does excitement feel like? They might say, oh, I get this sort of feeling in my chest or in my abdomen, like it's I got butterflies in my stomach and like I'm sweating in my, or whatever it might be. And what's really interesting as a mental experiment is that the degree to which context changes everything. So if, for example, a young fighter is saying to you that, oh shit, I think I'm nervous about this fight. Like maybe I'm like, I feel nervous. And if you get them to describe physically what's going on for them while they're feeling nervous, and then they say, the same thing I sort of just said before, that, tension in the stomach, jittery, they're shaky, their voice is fun, like whatever it might be. And you sit down with them and you say, okay, so if we were to change the situation and you were at Dream World and you were about to get on a roller coaster and you're physically feeling all of these things, how would you describe how you're feeling? And generally someone says, oh, I'm excited. Like I'm looking forward to it. And like ultimately, the only difference physiologically, well, there is none between excitement and fear. The only difference is cognitive. It's like the thoughts that are wrapped around that physical sensation. And so that's an easy one because it's an external thing that's causing it. It gets a bit more difficult when you're looking at, well, day to day, like why did I just snap at my wife when she mentioned that I hadn't taken the bin out, or why like did I nearly punch my boss in the face? Like, those are a little bit more difficult, but you've got to start sort of small and work your way up. And then the other aspect of that in terms of emotional regulation, something I talked to our mutual friend Ben quite a lot about, is control of your emotions. I'm sure you've heard a lot of young men over the years sort of come in completely untrained, no idea what they're doing, and they say, but bro, like when I lose it, I see red, and then and woefully ill-equipped to do anything remotely resembling fighting. So for a lot of guys, when it comes to fighting, and something I talked to Ben a lot about, is actually cutting that out of the equation as well, like not allowing anger to be the fuel source for you in competition. And we do a lot of experiments around trying to shift your mindset from being a caged animal who's going out there and going to just wreak havoc, to being more clinical and approaching what you're doing as a surgeon. and looking at, not having anger, but also having no remorse or no mercy for your opponent. And thinking things like the fact that the safety and well-being of your opponent is the responsibility of the referee. It's not yours. Um, and just that whole process, I think, of then being able to sort of say, well, I can behave in an angry and violent way with complete level-headed calm and control. And once you tap into that, then you begin to realize that there's a huge difference between being controlled by your emotions as opposed to being the person who's utilizing your own emotional state to fuel your performance.
Is there anything you stock say that you can actively do when you're going to training, or whether it's something, say, you sit down at the mat before you start, is there things you can say, or why you're actually doing it that you say you get your guys to do to be more hyper aware or hyper vigilant of that to actually start doing it? Because I guess like anything in sport or life, whatever, it's fine to say, but you'd never try it for the first time when a cage is locking behind you. And if you want to practice it every single day, what are some things these guys can do so it's not like they're not going in like a cage animal, they're going in as a disciplined athlete like they should be? What are some things they can be doing?
The main things I'd recommend for anyone, and it's not glamorous or like appealing, are things like journaling, both in terms of like your mental state, but also from a technical perspective. Like log your sessions. Like if things were going well, like write it down and try to hypothesize about why they went well or why they didn't. Um, Also, frequent debriefs being incorporated into training. So every session that we do, there'll be sort of peaks and troughs in terms of activity levels, and in between segments of drilling, like debriefing collectively, going around the group, asking people how they went, getting them to identify things that they did well, things they would want to do differently, getting them to evaluate the performance of the people around them as well, and doing bigger debriefs at the end of every session. And then when it comes to getting ready for a fight, I think I'm a huge believer of the fact that people, for one, should begin a camp fit. Like you shouldn't be using your camp in order to get fit. It's really about like bringing all of these different systems into play, like getting your weight cut on point so that you're peaking on you're not only making weight but you're athletically peaking on the right day. Working on established techniques and strategies and tactics that you have, not trying to incorporate something revolutionary into your game at the 11th hour. Avoiding injury through by treating your physical training as prehab nearly. And alongside with that, and I think this is massively neglected by people, is incorporating the mental training in terms of setting aspirations, dealing with adversity, like all of that stuff from day one. Like that should be incorporated into everything. And also just building like and modeling for the younger athletes around you, modeling the same approach that you expect of them. So being open and frank about your own emotions, explaining if something's impacting you, why and how it's impacting you, being able to talk about how you're feeling generally, and avoiding the innate masculine temptation that we have of just concealing pain and negative emotion through dark humor. And there's a place for it, but also I think there's a place to sort of sit down with your peers and the people who know you best and just sort of genuinely express that you care about what's going on and show that through being curious about what's happening for each other outside of the gym. Um, and my coach, Gary, he's very, very invested in every single person who comes through those doors. He's monitoring them throughout their prep for their fights, calling them outside of the gym, checking in on them. And again, ultimately, I think modeling that through the way that you treat the people that you work with, and pointing it out when people aren't behaving in an appropriate way as well. I think those are some of the things. But ultimately as well, things like breath work, mindfulness, journaling, they have a mixed reputation. Like I know that they're popular and they're regarded, but also a lot of people are like, oh, that's not for me. So if you use the voice app on your phone, like the voice notes app, you don't have to like write to journal, but keep a log. Everything is data.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And I think it's a conversation that I have with athletes so much. Hey, it's like being an athlete is everything that you do outside of your training. Like the training don't get me wrong, it's hard, but like if you're athletic and you're committed, you do it. And everyone does it. And I find what really separates, I find our most elite athletes that we have on our books and our roster is what they do outside of training. And all of them do these things that you're talking about. All of them do meditation. All of them do breath work. All of them are in touch with their emotional side. And I'll tell this story quickly. So if you're a young fighter, you can connect with this. I remember the first time I worked with Israel Adesanya, we were in Las Vegas. We were in this huge room. We had just finished cutting weight. Izzy had this huge suite. I came over with a little bowl of frozen fruit to give him. And me and Israel are pretty close now. We get along really well. But back then, like we were still kind of getting to know each other. So I was kind of feeling it out and being like, okay, like what's going on? And he was sitting at this at this chair looking out the window. And this, I'm pretty sure this made it on the UFC embedded. But at the time, he had a full film crew. They were doing a documentary. There's cameras everywhere. So I'm kind of like sneaking in, getting this bowl. He's staring out the window and he's just bawling his eyes out. And he's just crying. He's just crying. And he was talking to the camera. He was saying, and they're like, "What's the matter? You okay?" And he's like, "Yeah, of course I'm fine. I'm just so grateful for this moment. Like I've worked so hard to get here and I just want to take it in and I want to take it in for everything it is. And I just want to let myself feel what I'm feeling." And part of that was this overwhelming gratitude. And he wanted to cry. And I was a bit like, wow, like that was one of the first insights that I had as a practitioner of, wow, to get to this elite level, it's not just training. There is so much more than just this training.
Yeah, and that's a man who, when he's in a terrible position and he's in a lot of physical discomfort and there's all of the stress around him, he's not likely to break because he doesn't have that inauthenticity thing, like this whole like internal negative self-criticizing voice that we all have. Someone who's faced up to their emotions and tapped into them in that way, they won't behave unexpectedly under pressure. Like they know how to navigate those waters. So I love that. The like I don't have any tattoos or anything, but if I did, probably one of the things that I would sort of as a reminder to myself, there's a saying by an ancient Greek guy called Archilochus. It's that we never rise to our expectation. We always fail to our preparation. And I think that's so true. Like it's everyone thinks that, oh, if you're skipping out on like your form when you're doing reps of a drill, it's like, oh yeah, but on the day I'll do it right. It's like, no, you're not just avoiding doing it right now. You're actually training yourself to do it badly. And under pressure, when you can't think, when you're tired and you're sore and you're a little bit afraid, the quality of your decisions is gone. Like you're only going to be able to do the things that are sort of embedded through repetition at that point. And so for someone like Israel, being able to sort of weep in gratitude like that, it's a weird thing for a lot of people. It would make a lot of men uncomfortable being present with that. But like the reality of it is, like, what does that dude have to fear after that? Much respect for that.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal thing. The last thing I want to chat to you about is stock, and I think we was talking about this beforehand, and this is a topic that does not get nearly as much airtime as it should, not just in combat sports, but in all sports, is when athletes are making that transition, when they're finishing their career and they're transitioning from, okay, I'm being this athlete, I am the fighter, I am the grappler, I am the whoever I am, and then they're transitioning into the next phase of their life and going through that identity transition. Can you talk us through that?
Yeah, sure. So you would know better than anybody, like the level of sacrifice and dedication it takes for these athletes to do what they do to the level that they do. And if you've been competing for 10, 20 or more years, the number of sacrifices that you make on a day-to-day for that, the time you're not spending with friends and family, the time you're not eating the things that you want to eat, like all of this stuff, it's all like in essence, it's all sacrifice or it's all payment in order for you to be able to go out there and chase your dream of being one of the handful of best fighters in the world or whatever it might be. And there's something about the highs and lows of this sport where the highs of it are, there's probably nothing that can compare to it. And the dejection and sort of crushing burden of loss as well is just as far in the opposite direction. And I think for a lot of men, when they come to the end of their competitive career, a couple of things happen. One, they fight for too long. They keep taking fights, they go on a skid, and they want to go out on a win. And so they say one more, one more, one more, and they tarnish sort of their record at the tail end of their career. And the other is that they're so focused on getting to their objective that they never really think about, well, what happens when you achieve it? And like there's an old saying about like, if you achieve all of your goals but one would be a good thing, right? But if there's no more worlds left to conquer, what do you do? Like it's almost depressing just thinking about it, in my view. And so I think for a lot of guys who say that they want to be a fighter, I think from the very beginning, like it's really important to start having those conversations about, well, what does that look like? Like, do you want to be, what's your goal and what are the objectives to get to that goal? You want to be in the UFC? You want to fight on the undercard? Or do you want to be the middleweight champion? Like, okay, well, what does that look like? How do you get there from here? And what do you do once you get there? And if someone can't talk to you about what happens after they achieve their goal, then I think it's time to start having those conversations straight away as soon as you can. Well, okay, but what then? What then? And I think that when it comes to goal setting and aspiration and stuff, in my experience, like the vast majority of people never reach their potential, like unfortunately, for various reasons. And some of the most talented people I know aren't the ones who really thrive. It's often the ones who have some level of natural aptitude, but like this ruthless determination and dedication where they stick to it. And so I think that it's really, really valuable that if you have this moment in the sun and you've got good earning potential, you're doing well, are you being responsible and wise with your money, or are you going full Mike Tyson? Like what's your backup plan? What happens if you get injured? Because like a camp itself is expensive, right? Paying all of the professionals, covering your own expenses and all of that. I mean, it's not the most profitable endeavor unless you're one of a very small number of people. And so I think ultimately the two big questions I would encourage every person who's either considering being a fighter or who is a fighter, that they should ask themselves is, one, why do you fight? Like, why do you fight, or why do you want to fight? And what does that do for you? What does that mean for you? And the second question is, what do you do when it's done? And I think there's no one answer to that, and I think that the smartest guys out there are constantly building their identity. They're building a brand, they're building whatever it might be, building connections and networks so that they have an exit strategy. They might end up getting involved in like commentary or promotion. They might move towards coaching. They might go into like promotional speaking, like whatever the case may be. But for God's sake, like have something in mind, because you don't want to be at the point where you're done physically, like you've run your race and you don't have pathway forward. So yeah, I think just that forward thinking is so important. Better here in Australia, I think, because our medical system is a lot nicer than the one in the US. But it's something we definitely need to think about.
The last thing I want to ask you is talk about that is that, do you sacrifice the identity of being the athlete to becoming the dad or becoming the guy that really looks after his lawns on the street? You're that guy. Like, do you have to sacrifice that identity, or do you merge it into something else, or how does that work?
Well, I believe that what you do in one realm kind of transcends that realm, and I think that how you do one thing is a clue to how you do all things. And I think if you're someone who approaches your life with intentionality, and you're diligent, you're disciplined, you know how to not take yourself too seriously, but at the same time, you know how to work and what to do, I think you can and should have like a robust and healthy self-image that's not tied to fighting. Um, I think it's so hard to be a good fighter that anyone who does achieve that should justifiably be proud of themselves. But I think it's also self-limiting to reduce yourself just to that, which is why I think it's really, really good when I see, and I talk to some fighters who formulate like a persona or an identity whether it's whatever their fight name is, and labeling that as like a mental construct. So it's like when I'm fighting, I am this version of myself. But that allows for a version of myself to exist outside of that context. They can draw on all the lessons and all the learnings that version of yourself has had, but the only version of yourself that has the job of fighting should be like that quarantined out like persona. Because if you let how you behave in the ring bleed into like your identity outside of the ring, it makes sense that when your fighting is done, you feel like in a sense you're done, and it's something to be grieved rather than celebrated.
Yeah, absolutely. Could not agree more. But Istok, I am very appreciative of your time. We are coming up to time. So if the people do want to get in contact with you, I know getting in contact with you can be a little bit difficult. Is there an email or is there a way that these guys can get in contact? Because after listening to that, there are plenty of athletes that I think they need this. They need to hear this. And sometimes it's difficult to do this, like anything. How hard would it be to learn jiu-jitsu without a coach? You can get so far with YouTube instructionals, right?
Absolutely.
This is an area that if you're a serious athlete, you need to be taking it serious. And if people do want to reach out to you and chat to you more about this stuff, what's the best way for them to do it?
I'll leave my email address. I guess you can put in the show notes, but I'll just leave the address, istok.stanojevic@gmail.com. And look, I'll follow up with you. I'm looking at a couple of projects that I'll be working with in the near future, both with Ben and another mutual friend of ours, who's a brown belt down in Victoria, ex-copper, who's sort of rebuilding his life after his experiences in the police force. And I would encourage anyone who wants to shoot me a line to feel free to do so. I'm pretty responsive. I don't have anything to sell. Like I don't have any products or a website or anything to push, but I just genuinely am passionate about this stuff. And I'd love to hear from anybody who wants to have more of a conversation.
Yeah, that is awesome. And I'm definitely going to annoy you in the future and get you back on the podcast and pick your brain, because there is about a million more hours of things we could talk about on this. But yes, Doc, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule and coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
And there it is, another episode of the TFD Performance Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, then be sure to leave us a 5-star review. And if there is anything else you would like to hear us break down, please send us a message on our socials and let us know. This podcast will be available through the podcast app, iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. And if you follow along our socials at _fight dietitian, you can see all of the best bits from our podcast episodes. Thanks for listening in, and I'll see you guys for the next episode of the TFD Performance Podcast.